Now, in addition to those first two lines of evidence, embarrassing testimony. Usually when you make up a story and you include yourself in that story, if you were to lie, you tend to make yourself look better, not worse than you typically are. But did the writers of the New Testament do that? Well, no, there are many cases that they did not. For example, during that time, the testimony of women was not taken very seriously, unfortunately. So you would think that when they mentioned the resurrection, that if they made it up, they would have said that the disciples, like Peter and John, discovered the empty tomb first, and then they declared that Jesus had risen to the trembling women. Well, that's not what the Bible records. The Bible records that it was women who first discovered the empty tomb. And in that culture, that would be considered embarrassing because, as I said, their testimony was not considered as good as a man's. Why would you make up that detail if you wanted people to believe a false story? Fourth, there's excruciating testimony, which means that the disciples preached that Jesus of Nazareth had actually died and rose again. Now, if they made that up, why would they do that? Some people claim that the disciples may have done that to gain money or power. But in actuality, all but one apostle was martyred for what they believed. In many cases, they were tortured, they were beaten, they were jailed, and then killed. If they knew that what they were saying was a lie, you would think that eventually they would confess, or that some of them would confess before being killed. Now you may say, well, what about the Muslim martyrs, or martyrs of other faiths? Well, the Muslim martyrs did indeed die for their faith, but they died based on what they had been taught, and sincerely believed that was true. The disciples actually lived during the time of Jesus. So if Jesus had not actually risen from the dead, the disciples would have known about that. We'll get into a little more evidence for the resurrection in a bit, too. Expected testimony has to do with prophecy. Now, there are many different evidences of prophecy, but the one that stands out the most to me is Isaiah chapter 53. If you've never read Isaiah chapter 53, I encourage you to read that tonight. And it looks like, by reading that would have been written during New Testament times, because it so obviously is pertaining to Jesus, talking about the suffering servant. But in actuality, it was written hundreds of years before Jesus was ever born. And then finally, extra-biblical testimony. That's the idea that there are sources outside of the Bible that confirm a lot of the details that the Bible claims to be accurate. Now here we have 10 ancient non-Christian sources that include a lot of information that we find in the Bible. And that comes from historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thallus, Phlegon. We've got government officials like Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, and other sources like the Jewish Talmud and the Greek writer Lucian. All of these were not Christian sources, yet look at the facts that they confirmed. They confirmed that Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar, that he lived a virtuous life, that he was a wonder worker, he had a brother named James, he was acclaimed to be the Messiah, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, an eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died, he was crucified on the eve of the Passover, his disciples believed he rose from the dead. Now I should stop here and say that doesn't mean that these non-Christian sources believe that he rose from the dead, but they at least acknowledge that the disciples believed that, and that his disciples were willing to die for that belief. That Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God, even when it cost them their lives. So some good evidence that not only do we have an accurate copy of what the original said, but that the original actually told the truth about events that occurred.